Fire away.
So then, on top of the event of 2018 and the hurricanes that hit in November 2020, 2020 was also the year in which the so-called COVID pandemic took hold, and many countries around the world took measures that very seriously, adversely affected their national economies. And Nicaragua was faced with that situation as well. But what Nicaragua decided to do was to follow the guidance of the World Health Organization. They started preparing at the end of January 2020. So they began all their preparations. They set up their protocols for dealing with patients who possibly were infected with the COVID virus. They set aside, I think it was a total of 17 hospitals around the country with special COVID units with specially trained staff to attend to people who may have been infected with COVID. They set up their testing protocols. They set up measures in the airports to detect people coming in who may have had a temperature and may therefore have had the COVID infection. So they set up all those preventive measures, preparatory measures, but at the same time they organised a massive programme of house-to-house visits to, I think they were visiting a total of about, they were reaching a total of about 4 million people with those house-to-house visits.
What was the purpose of the house-to-house visits?
The house-to-house visits were to educate people about COVID, tell them, instructing families, what the procedure to follow if they were worried about somebody having flu-like symptoms that might be COVID. They explained to people the treatment that they hope to be able to provide in the hospitals. They encourage people to make sure that if they had symptoms that they thought might be COVID, to report to their health post, their nearest health post, and the health post would then make sure that they got tested for COVID. So they had this massive preventive program going house to house. That program started, the first case we had was I think it was in March of 2018. That was the first case, but they'd already been put into operation that house-to-house program of house-to-house visits. and in Nicaragua, they didn't close the schools. They implemented a policy of mandatory masking in public spaces, in public offices. Private businesses were allowed to decide how they wanted to implement the possible use of masks. Masks were expected to be used by children in school.
But there was no lockdowns, or people didn't have to stay at home?
No, there was no lockdown, because that would have been disastrous for most Nicaraguans who depend largely on informal economic activities. And if the government had insisted, as they did in El Salvador and to some extent in Honduras, that people stop their economic activity, that would have been an absolute disaster for the economy.
Because the Guardian newspaper in the UK reported that the government was allowing people to die on the streets and that they were burying them in secret.
Yeah, and the more ridiculous opposition propaganda. The opposition got so desperate here that they couldn't find suitable photos to terrorise people, that they started using photos that they took from media outlets in countries like Ecuador, where there were people dying in the streets, and where people were left in the streets, bodies were left in the streets in Ecuador. But the opposition took those photos and put them on social media saying this is what's happening in Nicaragua, which is a downright lie. And so And for example, let me give you my experience in Esteli. In Esteli, we have a community centre which runs an education programme. Now, through all 2020, we had one person who had to be hospitalised among our teaching staff, and she was quite unwell. She needed to be hospitalised. She was in hospital for about a week, only a week, and she got better, and she was sent home with what do they call those measures? Isolation measures.
Yeah, self-isolation.
That was another of the functions of the door-to-door education program, helping people understand how to isolate if somebody was diagnosed with COVID, what measures to take inside the home to make sure to minimise the risk of other family members being infected. And the way they managed treatment of people who were identified as having COVID was that people who had COVID were visited often in person by Mensa staff to see how they were doing over the period of their recuperation. They were given a medicine like ivermectin and other similar medicines.
But they had ivermectin here?
Yeah, they used ivermectin.
Really?
Oh yeah. And initially they used hydrochloroquine before.
The malaria drug?
Yeah, they used hydrochloroquine before.
So why were they using that here? And in America they were saying ivermectin was given to horses with worms.
Horse paste.
So they were given this. Well, because that's extraordinary. Because I thought it was weird reading about it. That why would anyone give a horse medicine to people?
No, but that's the propaganda. That's the opposition propaganda. Ivermectin is a very
anti-parasite,
a very well-known anti-parasite medicine. But
and they knew about that in Nicaragua.
Yes, but the thing about ivermectin is that it helps reduce viral load. And that was the reason that they were prescribing it, because the medical science had demonstrated that ivermectin reduced viral load and helps people. It moderates the symptoms of an aggressive virus like the COVID virus is supposed to be, and it enables people to recover more quickly with fewer symptoms.
Wow.
And the government was using that, and I think they used.
And where did they get ivermectin and hydrochloroquine?
It's a very common medicine.
Oh, you mean it's here? They have.
Oh yeah, you can buy it over the counter.
Because I'd never heard of it, right? And it just seemed really weird that people would be going, because if the newspapers are kind of saying, oh yeah, it's deworming drug for horses.
In the United States and in North America and in Europe, there was massive propaganda against early treatment.
Right.
They said to people, well, when you feel really sick, come to the hospital. That was the medical advice that people were given. But in Nicaragua, they took a completely different preventative approach to try and stop people getting COVID in the first place. If they were identified as having it, they took measures to minimize the symptoms and ensure that other people in that family's environment were as less likely to catch the virus. And it was a very strong preventive emphasis, but that is Nicaragua's community medicine model. They have superb hospitals now with very modern equipment, but their essential fundamental policy is preventive medicine.
So would you say that the death rate here wasn't that bad?
Well, I just give it. I gave you my anecdotal experience.
But generally,
person, and we have a staff of about in our community centre. Our total staff is probably about 35 people. We have hundreds of people using our community centre. Out of all those people that I know about, there might be other people who'd been taking part in our community projects that I don't know about. But there was only one case of somebody needing to be hospitalised.
Wow.
Right.
And so when did you get the vaccine in Nicaragua?
And I think it was sometime in 2021. I can't remember, in mid 2021 I think it was.
Right.
And then the government.
But that was when the worst was over, right?
Well, I mean,
that was the start of Omicron.
Well, yeah, I'm afraid I'm not au fait with all the
okay.
different states, because one of the reasons that I'm not au fait with how other people in other countries have experienced the virus is because our experience certainly where I was in Esteli, but generally in the country generally, was that although it was a serious disease that you had to be careful about, it wasn't a disease that was having a mass effect on the population because of the preventive measures that the government was taking. So our experience of the virus is very different to the experience in European countries or in the United States. And our experience was much more benign. And I strongly believe that the reason it was so benign was because the government took preventive measures in good time, starting in January 2020, that other countries didn't take, and that the government's policy here is a preventive policy, and they have this massive monitoring capacity as a result of their voluntary health promoter system.
What was the feeling here when the developed countries started vaccinating in December 20, right? And there was no vaccine. Was there alarm here that there were, because Pfizer wouldn't allow the copying of their to be used in the developing world, right?
Well, I think at that time the government reached out to different sources of different kinds of vaccines. They got the so-called, I think it was called the Sinopharm vaccine from China. They got a copy of the AstraZeneca vaccine from India. They got the Sputnik vaccine from Russia. They got a certain amount of support from, I think, the World Health Organization, that did in fact enable them to get access to some of the Western vaccines. But as 2021 wore on, they were able to accumulate more and more vaccines sourced from India, China, and Russia. And those were the vaccines that they started offering to the population. And they
were these provided free?
I think a lot of the Sputnik vaccines were provided free. I think all the Chinese vaccines were provided free, and they got
Sorry, what was it? The Russian government, the Chinese government providing them for free,
yeah,
or was the Nicaraguan government having to pay for them and then provide them?
I'm sure that all the Chinese vaccines were for free. A lot of the Russian vaccines were for free, and then subsequently the government began to pay for them. And they got a preferential price to pay for the Indian copy of the AstraZeneca vaccine. So, and they started offering that to the general population. It was not mandated. They didn't say, you have to have this vaccine.
Oh, it wasn't like in the UK, like if you were a health worker, they were threatened to sack people because if they didn't get vaccinated. So here it was a personal choice whether you got vaccinated.
Yeah, and there was strong pressure on health workers to get the vaccine. There was strong pressure on public sector workers in general to get the vaccine. But it was, if you didn't want it, you didn't have to take it.
Okay.
And there were no employment consequences. But for example, I didn't take the vaccine because I don't think they were vaccines in the traditional sense of what is a vaccine. And it was demonstrated very quickly, and within a matter of months, that it didn't stop you from getting the virus. And my wife, for example, she got the Sputnik vaccine, and then subsequently she was able to travel to Spain. She got infected again in Spain and had another vaccine in Spain. And then subsequently, when she got back to Nicaragua, she had another kind of nasty respiratory infection that she didn't get tested, but who knows what it was, you know.
And was that what influenced your decision not to be vaccinated?
The main reason I didn't take the vaccine was because I didn't trust that they were real vaccines in the traditional sense of the word.
So did people in Nicaragua call you an anti-vaxxer like they would in the UK?
No, people respected people here respect other people. They respect other people's political opinions. They respect their religious faith. They respect your views in general. People in Nicaragua are very tolerant. And so if you say, well, this is the reason that I don't want to take the vaccine, they'll say, oh, well, that's your reason, that's your business.
Okay, so, well, as we're on that about tolerance, the last thing I haven't talked to you about, and I'd be interested, is, again, the people of the left, right, often bring up the fact that abortion's not allowed in Nicaragua, and that they measure how left-wing or you are in the Americas by your position on abortion, right? And it's seen as a negative for women's rights in Nicaragua. What would you say to that?
Well, I don't feel entirely comfortable commenting on that because I'm a man, not a woman. But I know that the reality is in Nicaragua that if a woman's life is at risk, they'll perform a procedure to save the life of the woman. They won't call it an abortion.
So it's not like there's a threat on doctors that if they were to perform abortion that they would end up in jail or something.
Well, it's a Nicaraguan solution to a Nicaraguan problem. So they behave in a way that to protect the life of the mother without falling foul of the law in an obvious way.
What would happen if a woman went to the UK to have a termination, and would she be liable to be jailed when she came out?
The only cases that, as far I'm not aware of a case of any woman here in Nicaragua who suffered imprisonment or any kind of legal sanction as a result of having a termination of her pregnancy. You just don't hear about it. Where you do hear about it is in El Salvador, but you don't get campaigns by Amnesty International claiming that the El Salvadoran government is a dictatorship, an anti-feminist dictatorship because of their abortion policy. There are various countries in Latin America that have laws against abortion.
So that is it normal in Latin America to?
No, I think in most Latin American countries they're quite liberal about in their legislation on the issue of abortion, but there are countries where it is illegal.
And why do you think they talk so much about it in relation to Nicaragua?
Because the whole NGO sector across Western Europe and North America is funded by corporate money that's directed by the United States elites and the European elites. They target Nicaragua. The Amnesty International targets Nicaragua. Transparency International will slag off and criticize Nicaragua. And pick an NGO, and Global Witness will attack Nicaragua for its alleged violation of indigenous people's rights. And it's all propaganda designed to make the Nicaraguan government look bad. And that's not me being paranoid. Our Solidarity Coalition of people in North America and Europe has long experience of exposing these lies, but our material exposing the lies never gets anything like the coverage of the anti-Nicaraguan, anti-government propaganda, and because of the power of the media and the power of NGOs. And something I feel very strongly about is that I believe there's been a complete collapse in intellectual standards across North America and Western Europe because basic reporting criteria are completely abandoned. If you read a report about Nicaragua, criticizing Nicaragua, you'll practically never find a source. They'll never identify, they'll never offer a hyperlink saying this is a contrary view. They won't. You won't. If you read any reports in the Guardian or in Amnesty International or any of those NGOs about or mainstream media about Nicaragua, you will not be able to find a link to take you to another point of view. When we write about Nicaragua, we always put links to the sources of opposition propaganda so that people can make up their own minds, because that's a fundamental duty of anybody doing reporting. You have to enable people reading your report to be able to get acquainted with an opposition view so they can make up their own minds. But the anti-democratic procedure of North American and European media is to ensure that people cannot make up their own minds because they're denied access to the opposition, to the information that would make it possible for them to do so.
Stephen, can I say I really appreciate the time that you've given me. I think it's been so informative. I am amazed that I sit here, right? I thought I knew a lot about Nicaragua and I've been here a couple of times, but I definitely feel enlightened, and I really look forward to putting this out for people to just start looking at creating awareness, right? Thank you.
Well, thank you for talking to me, Richie.
And I look forward to coming again, because you've facilitated Molly and me getting here this time and acting as the go-between, and hopefully it's going to get more apolitical people to come in here and have the experience that Molly and I have had, which has been an amazing, and why I'll be coming back again in 3 months. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Richie.
Good.
So, and is all that all right?
Okay.